So I remember the first time I heard about climate change, I was 12 years old. We were watching Behind the News in primary school, and I'm not sure why, but for some reason it just made complete sense to me. And I remember walking out of that classroom feeling like I just had to tell people about what I had heard. I don't remember being particularly frightened, but I do remember thinking, here's a problem, we need to fix it, and we can fix it. Clearly no one knows about it, or else they'd be doing something, and all I have to do is tell everyone. That obviously didn't fix the problem. I soon found that people responded in ways that I didn't understand at that age, with a whole lot of assumptions about things that I believed that I had no idea about, being a socialist or a communist or a Puritan, being too earnest. And although I didn't understand those ideas, I did understand that I had to mainstream my message. So I started talking a lot about sustainable living, sustainable lifestyles. I got to university, I could study climate change then, but all you could study was science, and I wasn't a science person. So I studied geography, philosophy and law. I did human rights and community development, but the whole time I guess I was feeling that the things that I was passionate about, human rights and community development, would only get worse unless we fixed climate change. So I kept reading to myself and educating myself about climate change. And I remember during that time reading a book in which a few sentences just really stuck out for me and have stayed in my head ever since. And they said something like, if we keep emitting greenhouse gases at the rate that we currently are, then by the end of next century, and I was reading this last century, so that means this century, we will have warmed our planet by between 1 and 6 degrees Celsius. And to put that in perspective, the difference between now and the last ice age is only 5 degrees Celsius. So the Earth was covered in ice kilometres thick, and that change happened over thousands of years, and still there was huge disruption. Imagine what we would do if we warmed our planet to a similar degree over 100 years. And that, I guess, sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't think we would ever be so stupid, but it really just, I guess I was in awe of the change that human beings could make. Fast forward to 2007, 2008, I'd finished university. I'd decided to set up a green living business. I had a son who was 3 years old, and climate change was in the news a lot because Al Gore had released his film and the International Panel on Climate Change had released a report. And all of a sudden in the news I was hearing that if we keep emitting at the rates we were then, we could warm our planet by between 2 and 11 degrees Celsius. And that made me feel sick, because I knew that 2 degrees was the maximum safe level that we could warm our planet. 11 degrees I couldn't even fathom, and the end of the century was conceivably within my child's lifetime. So that's when I decided I really needed to understand the issue at a deeper level. I found a book called Climate Code Red, and I read that. It took me 6 months, I'd say, to read that book, just because halfway through I put it down and I cried for months. I remember waking up in the middle of the night with wet cheeks because I'd been crying in my sleep. And I remember going out to a coffee with a friend, talking about something entirely different and just bursting into tears, practically shaking him. You know, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why don't we care? I was quite dysfunctional for a long time. And then one day, sitting in the garden, I just asked myself a really simple question. And that question was, have I given up hope? Is it completely hopeless? And instantly I knew the answer was no. I knew that there was enough time, and human beings are capable of incredible things if we put our minds to it, and we certainly have lots of solutions. So as soon as I realised there was hope, then for me the only thing I could do with my life was put everything towards realising that hope. The thing that scares me more than climate change is my children asking me, you knew, and what did you do? And me sort of saying, oh, well, it all just seemed too hard, or I didn't have the time. So that was the easy decision. The hard thing was then to try and work out what I could do. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a billionaire, I'm not a politician. You know, what can little old me do? Over that time, I guess, you know, I went back to basics and I realised that the only institution that really can fix climate change is our government. I mean, yes, individuals have a role to play. Yes, businesses and industry have a huge role to play, but they can't and they won't do enough unless government creates policies that will drive that change and support that change at the speed that is required. So until our government really decides to fix this problem, then it doesn't matter what I do as an individual, it doesn't matter what businesses do, the change will never be enough. And so as an ordinary person with limited time and energy, the most powerful thing I can do is put pressure on our government to make them act. So I got really excited. I started writing letters to my politicians and signing petitions and volunteering. But soon I found it felt like it was the same old people just sending the same old message to the politicians who clearly didn't think that we were very important to listen to because there were other voices that were louder and stronger. So I realised that if that was going to be effective, then we needed more people who cared enough to do what I was doing. I realised that, you know, yes, we all need to stand up, but we also need to reach out to the people around us who care. So that was the beginning of Climate for Change. I did a lot of research. I found out a lot of things about how we most effectively reach out to people. And at a certain stage, I had this idea using the Tupperware party model. It took me a while to have the confidence to talk to anyone about that, but when I did, I found people were really receptive. So for a while, a group of us met in the pub trying to get things going. To cut a long story short, I was lucky enough to be selected to do Al Gore's training on climate change, speaking about climate change. And I guess during that process, spending 3 days focusing on what I was really passionate about, I just realised that we would never get anywhere if I was trying to juggle kids, work and starting up this organisation. So at the end of that training, I went and quit my job and started putting full-time effort into Climate for Change. It's been just over 2 years now. We are now an organisation with 3 paid part-time staff and almost 100 active volunteers and growing every day. The changes that we need to stop climate change in the time that we need to stop it are so big. You know, we need to completely transform our whole energy system in a very short period of time. We need to electrify our transport. We need to stop cutting down trees. We need to plant new trees. We need to find new ways to dispose of waste and better agricultural systems, better ways of designing our cities. Those changes are at a scale and a speed that we've never seen before. And the only way that that can happen at that scale and that speed is if our governments drive it. So I guess that's the first realisation. The second is that our governments are not going to drive that change without a social mandate. Even politicians who understand it and want to do more can't do more unless the population will support that change. And certainly those who don't want to do more or who are against that change can get away with stopping that change as long as people are convinced by the fear-mongering, even if it's just to the point where they're not supportive of the changes, even if they're not actively against them. So until we have a population that really gets how important it is to act on climate change and is committed to those changes, we won't have those changes. The reality is acting on climate change is going to be disruptive. In the long run, it will, you know, all the evidence says that energy prices will be cheaper, energy will be cleaner, the economy can grow, jobs can grow, all of those things are true, but we can't implement the changes we need at the time, on the scale and speed we need without disruption. And unless we have people deeply committed to the change we need, as soon as that disruption happens, or even before it, as soon as they're just told of that disruption, they'll start to have cold feet and we won't get the changes we need. So the first thing to understand is that change is not linear. So it doesn't look like that, which is good news because even though we might feel like we're way down low on this axis, it doesn't mean we're way back here on this axis. So it doesn't mean we've got all this way to go. Instead, social change anyway, looks more like this. It starts slowly over a long period of time. It hits a tipping point, peaks, and then at the end it peters off. So the good news is that even though we might feel we're way down on that axis, we could be way up here close to this tipping point, and only have a very short period of time before we get the changes we need. And in fact, that's what polling seems to indicate where we're at. So another way of showing this is this bell curve. So that's another way of showing the S, really. And this explains how social change moves through time. So it starts with a small group of people who are known as innovators. They're the people who have crazy ideas that nobody else thinks of. When those ideas get taken up by the earlier adopters, that's when they start to gain traction. And that's when they hit that tipping point there, which was the point on the S-curve. And that's when change happens quickly and the early adopters get on board. That's where we need to be. If all of these people are deeply committed to climate action, so much so that they'll be prepared to vote on it. In fact, they recognise that no matter what else they care about, if they care about education or health or jobs, the economy, people seeking asylum, whatever they care about, they can't vote for those things unless they vote for climate change. That's when we'll be where we need to be. So what we need to do is find these people here and get them on board, because the polling sort of shows that we're probably already close to this tipping point. So the good news is that these are the majority of people, and polling shows us that these people would generally agree that climate change is real, it's caused by human beings, it's happening now, it's serious, we should do something about it, even at some cost. And the vast majority of people love renewable energy. But if you ask them further what we should do and how quickly we should move, they wouldn't necessarily know. In fact, they probably wouldn't know. If you ask them separately, what do you care about, what do you talk about, what issues inform your vote, climate change would not be high up there. And they would probably be persuaded by concerns about jobs, energy prices, disruption, uncertainty. So in general, they agree that climate change is something we should do something about it, but that commitment is not so strong. Social research says that the way that most people are persuaded by people that they know and trust. So our theory of change is basically to find the people who already care about climate change, who already understand what needs to be done and the scale and speed at which it needs to be done, who are deeply committed as we need them to be, and support them to have effective conversations with the people in their networks who know and trust them about why they care. So research also shows that with a complex issue such as climate change, things like Facebook shares or reading articles, even messaging from environmental groups isn't enough to persuade people. It's too complex. And so the way that people really understand an issue, process it, and become committed to it is when they have face-to-face conversations with those people that they trust. So our approach is to support people who already deeply care about climate change, who are committed to the changes that we need, and support them to have much better conversations with the people who know and trust them face-to-face about why they care and what you can do about it. There's a lot of research about this. First of all, whilst information, facts, issues are of some importance, if we only focus on those, it tends to actually make people resist and dig into opposite views, even if they don't actually believe them so strongly in the first place. The conversations that persuade are firstly conversations that listen, build trust in that way. But they're also conversations that speak to people's values and access those values through emotions. The other really important thing is that a conversation that really persuades people is a conversation about what we're doing about a problem, not about the problem itself. So if you can imagine if you're sitting there talking to someone and saying, oh goodness, climate change, it's so terrible, we're all going to die, how awful, it soon spirals into sort of despair and hopelessness. But a conversation that still acknowledges the awfulness of climate change, which is important, but does so through talking about what you're doing about it, is much more powerful. So an example of that is, look, I've been so overwhelmed by everything I've been hearing about climate change. I'm really worried about how it's going to play out for my children. I'm really worried about the impact on the Barrier Reef. And I just feel like I can't sit there anymore doing nothing. I have to do something. So I've decided I'm going to write a letter to my local politician and try and, have some impact. Would you like to join me? That's a much more effective conversation. So what that means for our theory of change is that we can't just support people to have conversations, we also have to support them to act. And we have to support them to take actions that are commensurate with the problem itself and with the solutions we need. So the actions that we need support people to take are actions that put pressure on the people who can make a difference, mainly our politicians, but also on businesses, industry and other leaders who can have an influence and in many cases are actually blocking change. So really important to our model is that we're always helping people to stand up and reach out. Standing up by itself doesn't make the difference we need it to make, but equally reaching out isn't effective unless we're standing up. So the two really have to go together. The main work that we do right now is our gatherings. So those gatherings are actually structured in a way that, so if people want to get their friends and family on board, one way they can do so is to host a gathering. And the key thing behind those gatherings is that they allow an intimate and long conversation. They're two and a half hours long. So they create that time and space to have a good conversation about climate change. But because at each gathering we ask more and more people to host the next gatherings and we're recruiting facilitators to facilitate those gatherings, it allows us to have that depth of conversation at the scale that we need to create the change. So it's both about depth and scale. All the other things that we are building right now are designed to help people have those conversations. So that includes workshops on how to have better conversations, talks on how to have better conversations, online resources that help people do that. The other things that we're looking at are a list of movies that you could show people and talk about afterwards with talking points, as well as some things you could read together and talk about, so kitchen table conversation resources. After that, we're hoping people will actually tell us what they need and want, and we can create the resources that help them. At each gathering, we ask for a donation, and that goes a long way to supporting what we do. We're now at the point where the donations that come from our gatherings actually pay for our program manager to support the facilitators to deliver those gatherings. We also have some wonderful agents for change who are our regular givers. They donate anything from $5 a month to I think $100 a month or more. And that really helps us both because it gives us some income, but it also gives us a bit of a reliability of income so we can plan a bit. And that work, that money goes to supporting the rest of the organisation to do the other resources that are around supporting the pledge. Or it goes some way towards that. The other key form of fundraising for us is our annual crowdfunder. Crowdfunding is how we got started, and it really is the only reason we exist today. Our first crowdfunder paid for our website, our second crowdfunder paid for our first employee, our third crowdfunder paid for the next 2 employees. And without that, we would never have been able to do any of the work we've done so far. The great thing about it is also the people that we're supporting who are supporting us. So it's a really nice two-way relationship. And it's a really concrete and easy way for a lot of people to make a difference. So, you know, at first I felt a little bit nervous about crowdfunding, but actually now I love the fact that we work with the people that we're trying to help. They help us and we help them. Yeah, and I think our volunteers and our facilitators and our fundraisers all enjoy the conversations they have when they're crowdfunding as well. The rate at which we've grown and what we've been able to achieve in a very short period of time is remarkable. It's a lot faster than a lot of other programs that have done similar work, and I'm really proud of that and heartened by the fact that so many people have got on board and made this happen. On the other hand, it's what's necessary, and in fact, it's still not at the scale that it needs to be. So it's a strange thing because we have to aim for things that we can't really quite imagine, but we have to believe are possible, and we have to do everything we can to make that happen. Right now, we've got the gatherings up and going. They're going really well. I think, in a sense, we've proven the concept. There's some fine-tuning that needs to be done to make them more effective, particularly in just rolling them out at the speed at which they need to be rolled out. So for it to be effective, we have to be doing, each facilitator has to be aiming for a gathering every sort of 2 to 2.5 weeks, and we have to be recruiting new facilitators every sort of, for each facilitator we need a new facilitator every 8 weeks, I think that is. So we just have to make sure that all our processes for recruitment and getting gatherings happening are as smooth as possible, so that can really happen without glitches. So that's, for this year, we're really focusing on that. Once that happens, then we want to be able to sort of write up training and manuals so that we could franchise the model. Then we can take what we've learnt anywhere, specifically around Australia, but I've had approaches from Singapore and the US already, so that would be exciting. And take what we've learnt and either roll it out elsewhere ourselves or work with existing organisations to train them up in how we do it so they can do it where they are. So that's our mission. Our mission is to create the social climate in Australia for effective action on climate change, and that's what that means.